So the state of play was rather long and showed off a lot of games, and so we can't cover every single one, but there was a collection of titles scattered throughout it that we wanted to dedicate at least a little bit of time about, as well as talk about the state of play in general. So the first title that we do want to talk about here is I want to first start with actually a slightly negative one, and that is Borderlands 4. Now this one is interesting. I covered partially Borderlands 3 back in the day. And the reason why talking about Borderlands 4 is interesting is because it is a series which has evolved over time with all the iterations of Unreal. You go back and, it's one of the Unreal Engine 3 games, Unreal Engine 4 games, and now Unreal Engine 5. And if you were to take, for example, in my humble opinion, if you go back to Borderlands 2 and you take a look at this trailer of Borderlands 4, you would be sometimes scratching your head, actually, at the visual differences you're seeing on there. And now some of that is down to the art style kind of flattening the presentation out, which I think is readily visible here. Like, you kind of lose a lot of the big bells and whistles from Unreal Engine as soon as you start cartoonifying it heavily. That's not a bad thing, but also keeping within that Borderlands style, it does not make it look as fresh and as current gen as the other titles that we saw maybe in this showcase as a result. But the other thing is also gameplay. We'll have to see when that comes out, but man, I thought I kind of like the way Borderlands 1 was going. Borderlands 2 souped things up with a lot of cool destruction, especially on the PC version of that game. But it was also really heavily leaning into the RPG gun shooter thing, which I have come to start to dislike. But currently with this Borderlands 4 trailer, I was none too happy with it on a visual perspective, and as well gameplay didn't really do too much for me. Now this one, Oliver, can you talk about it? There's another Sonic game coming out.
Yes. Well, I don't know that Alex is too excited about this one, but I am very, very excited about this one. I think this looks great. It reminds me a lot of Sonic Racing Transformed, that 2012, I believe, kart racer, in terms of the way the game is handling, in terms of the weapons, in terms of the vehicle switching when you move between different areas. It looks like the central gimmick here on top of that Sonic Racing Transformed foundation is that you get to pick the next section of track when you're the leading car in sort of a portal system, sort of similar to Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart a little bit here, but you have some control over that system and you go into this next world. You're foisted into the next world, and that's like the next lap of any given track that you go on, and that's pretty interesting, I think. There's lots of customization and items that they've gone through and they've detailed, but the core racing gameplay looks a lot like Transformed, and I'm hoping that holds true for the final game. Visually, a little bit less positive, perhaps. It's a bit dated, I would say. It is a Switch game as well, of course, and it's on last-gen consoles and current-gen consoles, so it has to work on pretty low-power hardware relative to a lot of the other games in this showcase. I do think that Team Sonic Racing does probably look a little bit better than this, or even substantially better than this, and that was a Switch game as well. So that's a little bit unfortunate, but here the focus seems to be a little bit more on really big worlds with really big scale, something really big and arcadey, not like Team Sonic Racing, which was a little bit more laid back, a little bit more in that Mario Kart vein, that kind of restricted scale. Here they're giving you a really big environment to look at and explore, and dinosaurs here and there, and big areas around the track with lots of water and lots of crazy things and mountains. It's almost a little bit reminiscent, I thought, of Cruise and Blast on the Switch.
Oh wow,
if you remember that. In terms of the
John covered
really
that.
big arcadey environments, but maybe without a lot of the visual decoration that other games are delivering potentially. Now, in terms of rendering tech, this actually stumped me, but I did some research, and it looks like it's Unreal Engine, judging from the game's online.
Oh, what a
menu,
surprise!
Which I was confused by, a little bit confused by, although not totally unconvinced by. There are some things that I think point to Unreal outside of that the simple fact that we do know it's Unreal, based on the fact that it's licensing Unreal technology, because in some areas the indirect diffuse lighting looks pretty good, more modern than you might expect from other engines, from your Unities, from your possible in-house engines at Sega.
Right.
And the SSR to me. It looks pretty Unreal-like to me. It looks a
Right.
little bit like that Unreal SSR. It looks pretty reminiscent of that Unreal SSR. But the materials and models, it's not a very Unreal look to me. It looks very stripped back relative to a lot of Unreal Engine titles. Again, it's working on Switch, so maybe that stuff wouldn't be appropriate for Switch. They want to have a consistent visual look. They don't want to have to simplify the materials, whatever. That makes sense. The last thing here is that this is not developed by Sumo Digital. They developed the prior Sonic kart racing games, but this is a Sega joint internally. But apparently they have some people working on this game who have a lot of racing game experience, and hopefully this can work out well. I was really excited to see this.
Yeah.
This is probably my number one game of the show. Probably not my number one game of the show in terms of its technical attributes, but I'm super excited to play this. I know John is too. We both signed up for the network test. Hopefully we get in, and maybe we can enjoy some kart racers, because to me, the Sonic kart racers are the best kart racers available outside of Mario Kart. They're really, really high quality games. So hopefully this one will be too.
That's a ringing endorsement. I recall playing the first title on PC because it was one of the few comfy couch local co-op games on PC of that time era. It was something you couldn't find actually in a lot of titles, especially on Steam when it wasn't curated, and it was in the curated list. So I definitely played this one quite a bit. The original, the Transformers one that you just talked about. Yeah, and that was pretty cool. So if this is anything like that, this will probably be pretty great. Okay.
Yeah. Right there with you. I mean, I love Transformed, and that going back to the day that came out, like I remember that was actually a Wii U title as well, and that had this feature where you could play with 5 people with one person on the gamepad. Complete aside, but I just really fond memories. So yeah, I'm right there with Oliver on this one. It's great to see. It returned to land, sea, and air racing, and the travel ring system should be interesting. I'd be very intrigued to see if that mechanic runs smoothly on Switch, because the leader of the pack decides which ring to enter, which determines where the rest of the races go through, what area the rest of the races go through. So I wonder if that streaming system will work equally well on a Tegra system, but we'll see.
Yeah.
Cool. Next title, it was actually 2, but I think we're going to focus mainly on one, is there was 2 games announced from the Onimusha series. There's the re-release of Onimusha 2 Samurai's Destiny, which is originally a PlayStation 2 game, if I'm not mistaken. And then there is a new game targeting current gen and PC called Onimusha Way of the Sword, which appears to be using, based upon what I saw, this is Capcom, this is RE Engine. 2 very different titles in terms of tech vintage here, still within the same series and somewhat similar gameplay formula. But Tom, it seems like you had quite a bit to say about this one.
Yeah, I mean, more so actually the Onimusha 2 remaster than the new game. But Way of the Sword looks great. I mean, you've got like a combat where you can like kick along tatami mats, and it feels like, you know, Onimusha always had this strange link to. It always almost released coincided with the Devil May Cry series. Like,
right,
like on PS2, there's 1, 2, 3 on the same system. But yeah, very, very great. It looks like it's using RE Engine, as you might expect from Capcom. But yeah, I was more interested by Onimusha 2 remaster, for now anyway, because of the presentation of the trailer. Going back to those PS2 era titles is a bit of a challenge, especially with the way Capcom engineered a lot of their games in that time, where they were pioneered, really like top of the class in terms of pre-rendered backdrops. They did this for RE Resident Evil games of that era. And so it followed for Onimusha 1 and 2. I think 3, they pushed for more 3D political environments. But with 2, there's a hybrid approach. And a lot of the pre-rendered backdrops you can see in the trailer have an upscale applied to them, which is as intelligent as you could hope for. And they're animating backdrops as well. So there's like rain falling. It's like super detailed stuff, but how it appears in the result is you've got the, nicely upscaled 4K boost to the geometric elements, the characters, the 3D parts of the environment. Then that meshes with the pre-rendered stuff, like in the background sometimes, and you just think, that doesn't look quite like it's in sync. But that's kind of with the territory. They kept it, the scope of the remaster project kind of contained to reworking the assets that they had from that time. I suppose the only other point on that is that they have they're kind of keeping it faithful in terms of the aspect ratios. You've got a full 3 aspect ratio mode and a 16:9 aspect ratio mode. The 16:9 one is cropped, and it crops the top and bottom to kind of frame it, which makes sense given there's pre-rendered backdrops. That isn't so malleable. But
no,
but yeah, it's kind of it's an interesting project, and I think a good way to onboard fans ahead of the new game coming out. So yeah, definitely an interesting one.
Now, this is something John actually talks about quite often, is how do you present games from an era when the sets that were going to be displaying these games were inherently low resolution in general, like 480p at best, sometimes interlaced. I actually don't know about this game if it was interlaced or not. And then you also have the fact that the sets that these were on back then were malleable in terms of what resolution they could display at. It wasn't always at 480p. There could be intermediate resolutions, and screens of that era would actually display them in a pretty good way. And in a case like this one, it's one of the ways to solve the problem is to upscale the backgrounds that are 2D elements and then present them mixed in with ultra high resolution 3D elements. We've seen that a lot in the past before, and it's actually something that PC games in the 90s would have to suffer from a lot if you got a console port. But I don't know if it's the best way to do things. And here I would hope there is a mode that maybe retains the original resolution for the output, but then either through the application of a CRT filter or maybe really good integer scaling brings that up to full res and full screen size, close to full screen size on a modern set. And that could include things like super sampling the geometry so you don't get extra aliasing in there, but you get, at least, a good look. And I think that's maybe one of the options that they could add in here. It's something that a lot of developers have struggled with in the past, and I think there's better ways to present it than just one default way, and also maybe give people some options. So that's kind of what I think about that. Okay, let's go on to the next one, and that is called Midnight Walk. Probably the most visually distinctive looking game here. It's a first-person shooter. It looks like a first-person shooter that also is coming out for a variety of platforms, including PSVR, which should be interesting. And I think you very well described it, Tom, when we were talking about this earlier. It kind of is Tim Burton-esque designs in terms of visuals, but also it's going for the creepiness factor. It almost felt like a horror game in some ways throughout the trailer.
It did, yeah.
And first person, almost unexpected, and given how many third person games were in this showcase here. But what do you think about this one, Tom?
Yeah, I mean, it was up there with Dreams of Another in terms of being one of the more visually distinct games on the catalog. And just because, the most eye-catching part was the decimated animation on those enemies. There's a lot of some games do this for a stylistic push towards sort of anime aesthetic, like Guilty Gear Xrd. Love to use decimated animations, and it works well, and in the context of a horror as well, to generate a sense of fear, like something otherworldly. And I think they've nailed it. They've really right away the visual appeal is apparent, and it's a first-person game with some shooting in there. I have no idea how much they're going to push that part of it, but it is. It's got this sort of Nightmare Before Christmas world. And one of the interesting things reading the developer blog about how they're making it is they've created clay molds, clay creatures, all these monsters in real life, and then scanned them into the game engine itself. And from that, we're getting some beautiful, very realistic material interactions with lighting, which is a key mechanic of the game. There's like a sidekick called Pot Boy, who's got like a flame for a head, and you kind of have to, he lights your way through the world. And so you're kind of like walking through the darkness, trying to evade enemies, sometimes encountering them by the looks of things. And then you've got, because you're kind of miniaturized, you're also bumping into like giant matches, which you can also use to light your way. So it's very inventive. It reminds me a little bit of Little Nightmares.
I was about to say that. Yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah, it's just a little bit of that, but in 3D, but with the decimated animation. Anyway, just it was captured on PS5, and by the looks of things, most of the footage they showed was capped at 30 frames per second. I'm going to hazard a guess that they are going to offer a couple of modes here, because there's some footage in the mix which is unlocked 60, which actually looked, like it was dropping quite a bit as well. But it's early days, so that might be something we can look forward to as an alternative mode for VR users, or maybe it'll lock to 60 in the end. But I think that's everything I've got on this one.
Yeah, this is good. Like, I think it was really good that you brought up Guilty Gear, because I've in previous DF Directs criticized decimated animation. I think it has its place still, obviously, for going for a very specific style. And if it is, you are trying to look like claymation or something like that, I think that it really works. Another great game that we never ended up covering on the channel, which was a bit of a shame, that did a similar scanning process, was Harold's Halibut. That came out last year. I believe it was in April of last year, and that was another game where they had a really heavily inspired stop motion look to the game, but rendered in real time. But that was not a first person game. And I'm curious to see how that translates to first person, because you mentioned a lot of this presenting here at 30 FPS. And I'm curious if it was actually 30 FPS, or if it was so much decimated animation that it was maybe rendering at 60, but it looked like 30. Yeah. So
camera was at 30.
Yeah,
for sure. But yeah, it was just the animation on the enemies that was like decimated.
Right.
So
exactly.
Could be 15.
Okay, yeah. Well then that's even more intense. Not sure how good that'll feel if that is the end up target, but we'll have to see when the game comes out. But I think this was, at least from everything I saw, next to the Point Cloud game there that we just talked about, I thought it was probably the most visually interesting looking game that we saw at the showcase.
Yeah.